Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Michelle Jamin, and I am one of the co-conveners of the BERA Mental Health, Wellbeing and Education Special Interest Group. And I will be one of your chairs for today's event. We're very excited about delivering this. It's a very topical topic, and we've got a great range of speakers. But before I talk a little bit about what's going to happen, I'd like my co-conveners and co-chairs to just briefly say hello, say who they are. Jonathan, would you like to say hello first?
Good morning, colleagues. So I'm Jonathan Glazard. I'm Professor of Education for Social Justice at the University of Hull. My research focuses on school-based interventions to support mental health and wellbeing, particularly with an emphasis on non-therapeutic interventions. I'm also interested in the relationship between minority stress and poor mental health, and particularly the intersection between disability and LGBTQ identities. Thank you.
Thank you. Anthea?
Morning, everybody. My name's Dr. Anthea Rose. I work at the University of Lincoln as a research fellow, and I've been working for some years on the Uni Connect project that some of you may know about. And I also work on evaluation at the university, particularly looking at their APP, their TEF, and their international students.
Thank you. And Amy? Very quick hello from you too, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Amy Quickfall. I'm the head of school for the School of Education at Leeds Trinity University. And my research is around wellbeing of teachers, lecturers, student teachers. And I've also got a real interest in people working in education who have their own children and the particular situation that puts people in. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, then. So our theme for today is Holistically Healthy Humans, championing mental and physical well-being in education. And we will be exploring the intrinsic relationship between mental and physical health. And we have a really exciting lineup of speakers with us today, and they will be sharing recent research across our broad-based focus. So we also are very thrilled to be able to offer an interactive workshop here. We do miss in-person events, but we want to bring a flavour of that to today's event. So in the spirit of being active as well, we have Scott Butler, who will be introducing the Mindful Movement programme. More about that later, but just a heads up, Scott did invite people to bring a A4 piece of paper along with them for his session. So hopefully you'll have one at hand. Is that all everyone needs? Just that and a bit of enthusiasm. Is that right, Scott?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, it's there for a bit of fun. So thank you very much, Michelle.
Perfect. Okay, so more about that later. So our final session, we always like to introduce a panel discussion again to try and get some sort of interaction in our online events. And so we welcome your questions. Please do contribute. You are able to unmute and join in. If you want to pose any questions as our speakers go through their sessions, please do put them in the chat. We probably won't have questions immediately after because we've got a sort of tight schedule. We want to pack everything in. So if we can save questions to the end, that would be great. But if things pop up while the speakers are presenting, please drop your questions in the chat. As always, we do like to invite students to have a presence at our conference. So we've got a speaker, a student representative, and I believe, Amy, they're from Leeds Trinity. Today we've got a student on the panel to join our speakers at the end. Okay, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave before the panel because I do have another commitment, but I will be leaving you in the very capable hands of my co-chairs. And as you have heard, we have a very rich and full schedule, so I'm not going to talk anymore. Let's begin. And I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our first speaker, a colleague of mine from the University at Roehampton, Dr. Crystal Coxon. And Crystal's research looks at the link between diet, and student mental health and well-being, and how a better understanding of this can help inform educators to develop effective strategies to boost performance and mood in the classroom. So welcome, Crystal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen, and hopefully everyone is able to see that. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, Vera, for the opportunity. Just before I start, my internet connection hasn't been fantastic, so I hope that it will hold stable for the presentation, but if not, I have recorded a presentation that will be available after the session. Hello? Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so just to get started, my research focus, as Michelle mentioned, I'm at Roehampton, and my research focus is looking at the links between diet and mental health. I'm a registered nutritionist, and most of my research is focused on adults, but we're hoping to move into looking at these links in adolescents. And so the purpose of my talk today is to share some of what's been happening in the nutrition world, and that hopefully it can inform your policies, practices, and procedures that you're doing within the classroom. So there are three things that I'd like to do today. The first is to look at this link between diet, nutrition, and children's mental health and learning. And the second is to look a little bit more at what we call the gut-brain axis and understanding the role of diet in that connection and how it might impact children's health. And then hopefully if we get time later in the session, I'm hoping to talk about the evidence supporting practical strategies that promote healthy eating in schools. So the first thing to ask ourselves is, well, how healthy are our children at the moment? And are they eating a healthy diet? And these are data from the National Child Measurement Programme. And what we can see is this, although it's just a snapshot from the last few years, this gives us an indication of how healthy our children are. And we can see in reception age children from 4 to 5, majority of these children are presenting with healthy weight and a smaller proportion with overweight and obesity. However, in our age 10 to 11-year-olds, we have a much higher proportion of obesity and overweight. And the key concern here is that children who are overweight and obese carry that risk into adulthood. And so there is a need to address these high prevalence of overweight and obesity rates. And I think the other thing to mention as well is that these data, there have been policies and procedures that have been implemented over the last few decades, but they don't seem to be strong enough to be lowering our rates. We see, particularly with year sixes, we see a consistent and slow increase in overweight and obesity over time, and that is concerning. The second question is, well, how healthy are our children, or how are they following a healthy diet? And I'm sure you are very familiar with the Eat Well guide, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. But when we look at the intake of our children and adolescents, what we see is, unfortunately, they're not meeting the recommendations for 5 a day. Certainly with fish and oily fish, they're below the recommendations. The sweet beverage intake, although there's a downward trend, this still remains quite high. And in terms of nutrient intake, what we see as well is that there is an excess of free sugar intake or added sugar intake, an excess of total fat. And for fiber intake, most, particularly adolescents, are below the recommendations, and only 4% have actually achieved the recommended daily targets. In terms of key nutrients, and I've highlighted vitamin D and iron particularly because they play a role in mental health and cognition, but we can see that these are particularly low for our children and adolescents. And the reason why I've highlighted these is because vitamin D has been shown to be linked with depression and depressive symptoms, both in adults and in children. And iron status is particularly important in our cohort, in our female adolescent population. It is particularly low. It's a low across children, but particularly low across for female adolescents. And low iron can can impact and cause anemia and iron deficiency anemia, and that is linked with cognitive impairment. So overall, the picture is there are some aspects of nutrition and health that are concerning for our children. So I'm going to move very quickly to sort of the bulk of the talk, which is going to be discussing dietary patterns, because most of the research that we have at the moment focuses on dietary patterns rather than individual nutrients. And that's because dietary patterns provide a much broader picture of our food and nutrient consumption. And it's these dietary patterns that may be more predictive of disease risk. So what you'll see in the literature now is dietary patterns, for instance, the Mediterranean dietary pattern or the Western dietary pattern. And the Mediterranean diet, which you've heard about before, is a dietary pattern that has a high consumption of whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, fruits and vegetables, a high consumption of fish and seafood with a relatively lower intake of milk products. And then what you can see right at the top here is that processed meat and sweets are relatively consumed less frequently. This is in direct opposition to a Western dietary pattern, which is typically very highly processed. So it has foods that are very highly processed, very high in fat, sugar, and salt, and relatively low in fiber and key nutrients, like, for instance, iron, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D. So what is the link between these dietary patterns and mental health in our children? Well, I'm going to start with just sharing a bit of the research, and just a note to say with the type of research studies that we have at the moment, most of them are sort of observational in nature. So that means that there is some evidence, and there's some evidence to show that there's a link, but we cannot infer causality quite yet. But there is some sort of gaining momentum with research. And so I wanted to pick out a few that are of key note. Here, this is a study, and quite a large study of just under 100,000 adolescents, where they looked at the relationship between mental health symptoms and the sort of frequency of how frequent they reported mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, and stress, over the last 30 days, and consumption of very highly ultra-processed foods. So ultra-processed foods, which you also would have heard about in the news and media, are typically foods that are very, very highly refined, industrially produced, and very high in fat, salt, and sugar. And in this study, it was seen that when they adjusted for a variety of co-founders, they found that a frequent consumption of highly processed foods was associated with more frequent symptoms of poor mental health. With a Mediterranean diet, we also see that there are links in mental health, particularly in the realm of attention and depression and anxiety. So what we see here is that there is gathering evidence. We've got fairly strong evidence in adults, but there's more gathering evidence for children and adolescents. And here we see that there is a link, particularly in neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD, where a low adherence to a Mediterranean-style diet is associated with an increased likelihood of an ADHD diagnosis. And so too is that the children that have an ADHD diagnosis also show a low adherence to the diet. And in a sample of children with ADHD, a low Mediterranean-style diet was also associated with higher symptoms of impulsivity. So they measured impulsivity using a questionnaire, and they were able to see that link. In another study in healthy populations, and this was at about 300 adolescents, what was found is that a higher diet quality, which is a slightly different measure of a dietary pattern indices, it was associated with attentional capacity in adolescents. So although this is sort of observational and cross-sectional evidence, there is some evidence to show that it is linked with attention, and particularly in neurodevelopmental conditions. The Mediterranean diet is also linked in with depression, and we also see this data emerging in children and adolescents. And what we see is that the Mediterranean diet seems to be a protective effect, where it is linked in with the reduced prevalence and prevention of depressive symptoms in the normal population. Where we have a low adherence to Mediterranean diet, this is associated with depressive symptoms. And in a very recent cross-sectional study in just under 700 adolescents, what was found is that adherence to a low Mediterranean style diet was associated with an increased odds of depressive symptoms. So I appreciate you can't see this very well, but this is the DAS scale, which measures depression, anxiety, and stress. And when they adjusted for co-founders, they found that there was a link, particularly in depressive symptoms in adolescents. With anxiety, there is a little bit more of a mixed picture in that some studies find a link and some don't, but it appears that the link between a Mediterranean diet and anxiety symptoms seems to be much stronger in children. This is the data that we have at the moment. But in the links that we do see, they have a pattern that's very, very similar to the research that we have in adults. In other words, having a Mediterranean style diet is linked with lower anxiety symptoms. And I did highlight this study here, which did look at adolescents. And what they did is they looked at adolescent boys and girls, and they assessed their dietary intake. And what they found was when they divided two groups into emotional and non-emotional symptoms, having a dietary pattern of very high sweet fatty foods was associated with more emotional symptoms. And that was statistically significant. So a point to make here is that they didn't find them in other dietary patterns, but in the studies, in this study, it might have been underpowered to detect these associations. But at least we have some preliminary links showing that a Mediterranean diet is associated with anxiety. I'm going to move on to very quickly looking at the gut-brain connection, because this is a very exciting area of research that has really just exploded over the last few decades. And what's happened is that the research has really expanded our idea that the gut is more than just telling us about digestion and satiety. It's telling us a lot more. It is more intrinsically linked to the brain, and is linked with much more higher order cognitions. And so what you have with this gut-brain connection is you have a much stronger link with the gut to the brain. And you also have an environment called the gut microbiome, which includes a host, an ecosystem of bacteria and fungi and viruses that digest the food and create metabolites that then are released into the bloodstream or connect into the connection directly into the brain, into the vagus nerve. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of a complicated picture here. We don't need to worry too much about all the ins and outs, but the overall picture that is important to take away is that the environment within the intestine, this microbiome intestine, has a role to play in digesting the food, and through the metabolites that it creates and their variety of different metabolites, it links in with either stimulating the vagus nerve, or it is released into the bloodstream, or the other variety of measures. And so the key function here is that the gut microbiome it digests our foods and produces essential fatty acids, essential nutrients, but also hormones and gut hormones. The key thing here is that this environment that we have within our gut is very, very important, not only to influence the brain, but also it's this environment is influenced by a variety of factors. It's influenced by genetics, but it also develops over our lifespan. And this diagram just shows you that there are key moments across the lifespan where the gut microbiome will be influenced and changed. And there are, amongst a variety of different aspects, a variety of different factors that influence the gut microbiome. But the key here is that diet does play a key role in influencing the gut microbiome. And I'm just going to quickly flash through this slide, which shows you that the influence of the gut microbiome composition and how diet can influence it. If we have a diet that's high in fiber, particularly a range of different fibers from fruit and vegetables and whole grains, if we have a diet that is high in polyphenols, which are very beneficial nutrients that are derived from foods like fruit and vegetables, tea, coffee, and so on. And if we have a diet that has fermented foods, that confers a benefit to the microbiome system that exists in our gut. And so what it does is it promotes the growth of beneficial microbes that then support our system. However, a diet that's high in dietary protein, very high in saturated fat, that we typically find in a Western diet can lead to the proliferation of harmful bacteria in our gut. And this gut dysbiosis could really be related to a range of dysfunction processes within the brain and neuroinflammation. So the overall picture here is that there's evidence surely in children and adolescents that diet plays an important role in influencing the gut microbiome and the connections between the brain and the body. So let me just go back. Another key thing to notice here is that the gut microbiome plays a role in neurodevelopment. In other words, what we see is as we grow, that plays an important role in the microbiome changes as we grow, and it contributes to normal neurodevelopment, and certainly plays a role in our stress system, which is the APA axis. And what we see is there's some research showing that the composition of our gut microbiome is associated with cognitive development and brain volume in 1-year-old children. And in obesity research, what we see is that cognitive performance and brain activity is also linked in with the gut microbiome. There's some preliminary research also showing that probiotics is good bacteria that we introduce through diet or through supplements. And there's some preliminary research that it may actually improve anxiety and depression and cognitive function. So overall, what we can see is that diet plays an enormous important role in our children's health and well-being. And it's not only just the nutrients that we derive from the food, it's also the dietary patterns and a whole host of other adjunct nutrients that are important to feed the gut microbiome. But moving forward, what does this mean for schools? What role can schools play? And the key thing is that schools are a place where students have continuous contact, and it's an environment which plays an enormous role in influencing behavior. So we have an opportunity in schools to promote healthy behaviors that have a lifelong impact on health and well-being. And because children spend about 40% of their work time in the weekdays in school, having a platform where we can talk about what is a healthy diet and what is healthy food, and this can have an enormous impact on the children's health and well-being. So there are two pieces of information that I want to share in the last minute or two of my presentation. The first is that there is a role for a whole school approach in promoting healthy eating behaviors. And this whole school approach you would have heard about, and others would speak about later on in the session. But this involves having a whole school approach from policy down to linking communities and the family together with schools. And the research evidence is that if we have a multi-stage education strategy that involves nutrition education, schools and staff, and environment and parents and families, that does lead to changes. And the research evidence shows that it leads to changes within dietary habits and with an anthropometric values, BMI indices and so on. So having a multi-stage nutrition policy really leads to the best type of change for impacting nutrition. There are limits and challenges because, of course, the food system is very complex, and it's important that if we take a whole school approach, we need to understand the complexity of the food system and local needs. Just 2 more slides before I end. The first, there is some evidence that I wanted to share that if a whole school approach is not feasible where you are and you are looking to teach and make an impact in your school environment, there is some evidence that there are some approaches that may be more beneficial than others to take on. And so this systematic review looked at which approaches and strategies were effective in promoting healthy eating in schools. And this was across these 4 indices of changing food intake, preferences for fruit and vegetables, sugar, and increasing knowledge. And the outcome of this was that experiential food learning approaches, so these are getting children into the kitchen and school gardening projects and a range of different, getting them to have experience with food is enormously powerful. And it was shown to, in the systematic review, have the greatest impact in reducing food consumption, energy intake, and changing preferences. And the second, which was also cross-curricular approaches and curriculum interventions, were also beneficial in changing knowledge and reducing preferences and consumption. So there is some evidence that'll be very helpful for us moving forward, just thinking about what works and what could be beneficial in the classroom. Just to highlight finally some resources that may be enormously helpful. So the Food Fact for Life is a very comprehensive and progressive education program that's funded by British Nutrition Foundation and the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board. And it is a fantastic resource. If you haven't used it before, I really recommend it because they have a wealth of both free and paid for resources where they take a whole school approach, and you can use, they've got a YouTube channel and a whole lot of, it's a really very worthwhile resource to use. The second is Taste is a charity which promotes taste education. And this is based on the Sakatia method, which really helps children to get an experience of tasting fruit and vegetables. And they have both free and paid for resources. And then to highlight the Genius School Food Network, which brings together key stakeholders. And the key aim here is to work towards promoting health and food, more healthy food and nutrition system within UK schools. So these are 3 resources that I think will be really beneficial to you. Okay, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, and bang on time as well. Thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating, and lots of food for thought, if you like, for us all to mull over there. Thank you very much. So now we're going to move on to our second set of presenters this morning, and we have got Sarah Maguire and Alex Hennessy from the University of Manchester, and they're going to talk to us about an evaluation that they've done about the well schools, and it's a case study, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you have to say about this project. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Alex Hennessy. Apologies from Sarah McCarry. She couldn't make the revised date, so it'll just be me presenting today. I'll just share my slides. Hopefully you can see this.
That's
Yep.
perfect. We can see them. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you for having me today. My name is Dr. Alexandra Hennessy. I'm here from the University of Manchester. And I'm going to talk today about a piece of evaluation work we did of Well Schools. Well Schools is a whole school approach to supporting wellbeing. And by whole school, it really is whole school. It's not just about pupil wellbeing, it's about teachers, all associated school staff, and thinking about the wider community as well. Well Schools is a body of work that is being run by the Youth Sport Trust. The Youth Sport Trust funds and carry out a lot of work exploring predominantly how sport, PE, physical activity, what that can look like in communities, in schools. And in this particular body of research, they were interested in the connection between well-being and sport and physical activity and the bigger picture of that. So this was a project that we were kind of commissioned to do by the Youth Sport Trust as an independent piece of work to evaluate Well Schools. And it was a case study approach in the sense that we have 10 quite in-depth schools that are all very different types of schools on very different types of journeys to really understand the different ways this whole school approach to supporting wellbeing can look, the different contexts, the different factors associated with it. And as you'll see as we talk through, there are very different ways this has been approached, but also very different stories about that, very different contexts, but also some similarities and commonalities that can be taken and transferred to different contexts as well. First of all, it was quite a big body of work we did over the course of a year, so I have to thank my research team and our big team of research assistants that supported in all the different strands of the work I'll talk you through, and also a massive thank you to the schools and staff who contributed their time, gave really insightful data to help us understand and produce the case study piece of work we did for this. So to start a little bit more about what Well Schools is and the framework that underpins this. As I said, it is a whole school approach to wellbeing and really is whole school with a focus just as much on school staff and teachers and that kind of body of staff as well as the pupils themselves, really based on this understanding that well-being of the teaching staff is going to impact the well-being of their pupils as well. So understanding that connection and emphasising and supporting that connection is a big strand of the Well Schools approach. It has as much emphasis or even more emphasis on well-being as it does academic performance. It was an initiative that's really focused on understanding if we can support a culture of well-being across a school, it's going to be a much happier and much more conducive and effective environment for learning and all other associated academic and associated outcomes as well. So it's very much about this umbrella of culture and ethos around looking after the well-being of everybody, staff, school leaders, students, and the community, in a sense that will help improve outcomes across academics as well as other skill factors as well. There was a general framework that underpins it. Now, as being a whole school approach, it wasn't prescriptive in the sense of very specific things and ways schools had to go about promoting wellbeing. It was very much a kind of overall framework of things they needed to be thinking about, whereas the individual approaches were down to the schools on what was needed there, basically. But it sat across this umbrella of well culture, this ethos that well-being is put at the heart of school life, and it is the driver for everything. It's the thing that sits along the top, and everything else must fit underneath this culture and ethos. It was then supported by 3 pillars, which focused on different ways the schools could support well-being in a whole school manner. The first round was called Well-Led. So this was very much a focus on kind of school staff, teacher, and school staff wellbeing, and this can be actively supported and championed. And they highlight different ways that schools can think about doing this. having a charter, having kind of well school leads, having support for workload, having all sorts of other kind of initiatives and approaches within the school to support the well-being of their staff. How schools go about doing this, though, is down to them to strategize what is needed for their particular context, their environment, their staff, and make decisions and plan around that. The other two pillars were more focused on pupils, the well-prepared and well-equipped. So well-prepared was all about preparing children for life, preparing them physically and mentally. And ways they can go about doing this was thinking about sports and PE, mental health support, healthy eating, and general kind of physical well-being as well. Whereas the well-equipped pillar, and when we talk about the case study, you'll see these do overlap in practice a bit, was more about giving children the skills, teaching them the skills, the emotional skills, the leadership skills, the resilience skills, team building, giving and equipping them with those sort of skills to manage and thrive in life. So this was the general framework that is very open, very flexible, key goals, key ideas of what the schools could be doing, but quite what they do is down to them to strategize and to plan over their time and evolve over their time as being part of Well Schools. Alongside the framework, there was also a website, kind of like a Facebook Well Schools page almost, where different schools could sign up and communicate, and they'd use this space to flag different things that the Youth Sport Trust might be doing that schools could get involved with, share good practice, and communicate and be basically a community, or a movement was their word they used, of Well School culture, and really get that connection together. When Well Schools officially started, a lot of this was during the COVID period as well, so having that online space to communicate was particularly important. I can talk a little bit later about how schools did or didn't interact with that space, but the idea was there's a program going, there's an initiative, there's a framework for supporting this Well School culture, but also this collaborative networking environment about the schools that are signed up to it. So when we started the Well Schools piece of work, there were a set of about 30 founding schools, which were schools that were kind of almost invited to be a Well School because they were already doing considerable good practice around wellbeing. And then there were schools that signed up kind of 2020 and afterwards as well. So we've got a big range of schools, and at the time I think nearly 1,000 schools had signed up to the website to show their interest in being part of the Well Schools approach. So why is it important? So again, it was this to build on this emphasis that, you know, schools are an ideal environment and place for promoting well-being as well as academic learning. There's a lot of government reports about this, particularly the Public Health England report, which had come out during this time, that really sort of highlighted the 8 principles for promoting emotional health and well-being in schools. And the framework for Well Schools clearly was kind of tapping into these different kind of constructs, the idea of leadership, management, staff support, this whole school ethos about environment, curriculum, teaching, staff development, working with the wider family and community, giving students a voice, a focus on their health and well-being, and monitoring that over time as well. So it really did fit with these kind of principles that were coming out nationally as well. What we particularly liked as well about Well Schools, and I think what tends to be overlooked in research, is understanding the role of staff wellbeing in schools and how that also links into student wellbeing. So it really is this bigger sustainable whole school approach that the Well Schools approach was kind of advocating for. And recognising that if we're supporting staff wellbeing, that's going to impact student wellbeing, and that's going to impact lots of short-term and longer-term outcomes across learning and future successes as well. So in this body of work, what we aimed to do was to do 3 things really. First of all, and I think the biggest and most interesting part of the work was really this idea of what were schools doing and what was affecting that, this kind of idea of what the process was. I've reported here on 10 case studies of 10 very different schools using Well Schools in very different ways. And I'll talk about some themes that are coming out across those 10 schools, but it was very much about saying what they were doing in practice, how were they going about promoting this well school culture, what were they doing to equip and prepare their students, how were they supporting their staff, what were the barriers, what are the attitudes, what's the motivation, what's the longer term plan and sustainability. Alongside that was well, what's the impact of this? What's the perceived impact it's having at these different levels for schools, for teachers, and for students as well? And to have a look at some quantitative numerical data on kind of things around well-being and learning as well. So 2 kind of strands there. We had 10 case study schools, 10 very different schools. We had some founding schools who had been advocating and using this approach kind of prior to Well Schools, and then were kind of embedding and using the specific framework. And we had schools that had signed up very recently as well. So lots of different journeys and time spent on this project. Range of different primary schools, secondary schools, and also 2 special schools were involved as case studies. It is an inclusive framework and approach that is designed to fit into any sort of school environment. We had schools across England, all 4 corners, as well as representation in Wales and Scotland, and a whole array of different kind of demographic characteristics and contexts across those schools. So a really nice, big, diverse sample of schools on very different context environments and journeys with this to report on. In terms of our data collection, it was predominantly case studies, lots of qualitative interview data, really unpicking what schools were doing, how they were doing it, and their experiences, the barriers, the challenges, the opportunities, and the things that we're enabling and facilitating as well. Alongside that, we did have some surveys where we used kind of robust, psychometrically sound measures to assess kind of well-being at teacher and pupil level, but also associated outcomes. At the teacher level, we looked at teaching efficacy, school climate, personality, job satisfaction. With pupils, we looked at different types of well-being, physical activity, emotional literacy, school connectedness and engagement, and their perceptions of their kind of academic learning as well. The project only took was conducted over a single year, so it is just cross-sectional data, so we could just look at kind of the interrelationships between these types of variables, but also we could compare against some benchmarks from previously published data as well. There were 3 kind of outputs, and I'm going to give you a very concise, holistic overview of what we found. But if you want to find out more, we do have different levels of data, and I'll link to some of our publications you can access as well. So we had that numerical data from the surveys, and as I said, it was very descriptive. It was looking at what things are predicting well-being for teachers and students, but also some comparisons with benchmarks, although I have to massively caveat this was conducted as we were coming out of COVID. So obviously some of these factors are going to be influenced by the climate and the time that we were taking our measurements in. We conducted a thematic analysis of the interview data across the 10 schools to extract commonalities and differences, look at the kind of themes that were coming up across implementing Well Schools. And we had 6 kind of themes identified, which I'm going to talk you through today, with nice infographics. Sport Trust love their infographics, a nice way of really summarising complex data in a short and very visual and indicative way as well. And alongside that kind of broader thematic analysis across all 10 schools, we actually wrote 10 individual case study profiles of each of the different 10 schools, with the idea that this was going to be very important in terms of kind of dissemination to schools and education professionals, in the sense that they could, rather than look at traditional academic piece of work, they could pick up an example from a school like them and read through and get ideas of practice and how they can go about implementing Well Schools if they desired. So very different types of kind of output with different kind of aims as well. To give you a very concise whistle-stop tour of the findings, 6 kind of themes were identified via the thematic analysis. The first one being motivation, a school level finding of why be a Well Schools, what were the advantages of it, what's the motivation behind it, and what was it bringing at that kind of overall whole school level. It was clear that whole school engagement was key. It really needs to be embedded through the whole school and driven by the senior leadership team. That had to be the driving force behind that. But one of the motivations, one of the advantages of this framework was it was very organised, very structured. One school referred to it as an umbrella, a framework that sits across the whole of school practice, and everything they were doing, they could feed under this kind of framework. It helped them to organise, it helped them to monitor and evaluate, and gave them ideas of kind of provision, structure, and things they could do. It did provide a very nice, neat, and very feasible structure for these particular schools. Another school referred to it as the golden thread that threads throughout. This framework was easy for them to facilitate in the sense that it could be fed through everything they were doing. Another side of kind of the motivation is they wanted to be part of this group. They wanted to be communicating with other schools, sharing what they were learning and learning from other schools as well, and being part of this collaborative network. In terms of the well-led strand, so well-led schools, staff well-being, again, was one of the things that was the heart of this, this particular approach, the Well Schools approach. We found overall that advocating for staff well-being, recognising staff inputs, allowing staff to have much more autonomy over their practice, their roles and their well-being was leading to positive outcomes. We did see at a numerical level better staff attendance, job satisfaction and retention, and that was also reported through our qualitative work as well. Again, with the staff surveys, we saw that teachers are reporting lower levels of emotional exhaustion, lower levels of kind of burnout, lower levels of kind of feeling cynical about teaching, and higher levels of personal accomplishment compared to previously normal kind of data. So we were seeing some really nice comparisons with benchmarks at the teacher level. And individually, there were lots of different ways schools were going about supporting their teachers. There was a staff wellbeing charters, there were recognition, there was a lot of kind of individual bespoke, small level skills, things schools were doing to support teachers and recognise their contributions. There were all sorts of clubs and walks and things going on to look after health and well-being, and different approaches to kind of managing workload and being conscious of not overburdening teachers. At the pupil level, well-prepared and well-equipped tended to, in practice, not be separated out as neatly as the model and framework kind of outlined. A lot of the practice skills were doing prepared and equipped students similarly within a particular approach. Schools overall were qualitatively reporting that their pupils were healthier and happier and could really see the learning environment was becoming more effective and conducive. However, with our survey data, as I said, we were reporting on wellbeing as we were coming out of the pandemic. So we did see comparisons to baseline not quite being at the same sort of level, still kind of dropping behind, which does support the other kind of DFE work that was coming out at the time about the state of the nation, and that we were showing a dip in wellbeing in young people. However, we saw that in terms of physical health and physical activity, 85% of our pupils said their physical health was good to excellent. Most were doing 60 minutes or more of physical activity a week, which is the minimum recommended approach from the government. Ideal is 2 hours, 60 is the minimum. But there are loads of different initiatives you can see in the infographic there. Schools doing a lot of focus because it's a Youth Sport Trust funded project around physical health and PE and sports. Lots of different initiatives they talked about using relevant to their kind of their cohort and their context and environment, but also running initiatives to look at leadership and resilience, to look at social emotional development and engagement with outdoor learning as well. And if you look at the case studies, you can see all the different examples of what schools were doing there as well. The other thing was capability. Schools did find it quite a capable, quite a doable, quite a feasible and acceptable approach if they could manage competing priorities, if they could afford the time and the energy. It was a an approach that needs a lot of strategizing and planning. And if you have the time and resources to do that, it was working really well, but it does require a lot of senior leadership investment to think about how this runs. That I would say was the only barrier they talked about. Well, when they'd accepted it and had the time and made the space to do it, it was a really essentially easy structure to kind of fit between things. Obviously, the caveat, these 10 skills were chosen to share good practice. So they were schools that were really enjoying and really working well and finding well schools, you know, fitted into their context really well. Awareness engagement.
Sorry to jump in, Alex. We are sort of running out of time, so if we could.
I'm really near the end. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, just two quick little slides on the findings, and then I'm done. So awareness engagement was a smaller theme we looked at, but this was again, it stemmed from the leadership teams really being the driving force behind it. One school talked about kind of the idea that it was a stealth mode, that they didn't want to deliver it as just another intervention. And they wanted to embed it much more broadly. And in terms of sustainability, all schools said they'd be continuing with it. Lots of different ideas about how they would continue to evolve and adapt practice for it as well. And just to conclude, you know, schools enjoyed it. It was an opportunity to build relationships, collaborate and learn. They all said they would continue with it, with ideas of how they would continue to evolve practice. And they really did value the whole school approach and the supporting staff approach as well. But it is contextual. All the approaches across the 10 schools are very, very different, and strategizing and kind of deciding how it would fit into the school did require significant time and effort and leadership driving as well. And just finally, if you're interested in a little bit more, there's some web links there about Well Skills itself, our research, and the QR code to the larger reports there if you want to find out more specific things about what schools we're doing there. I think we're taking questions at the end, so thank you. Sorry for running a little over.
No worries, Alex, and thank you so much. And I'm really sorry I had to hurry on because that's such a fascinating presentation, really insightful there. And I think you've highlighted how important it is, that intrinsic relationship between staff and student wellbeing, and how we need to prioritise both in order to have both an effective learning environment and wellbeing environment. So I'm sure you'll have lots of questions at the panel. So now moving on, we've arrived at our interactive session. So if you didn't get the heads up at the start and you joined us late, I hope you've got a piece of A4 paper ready. So if not, grab one. And I'm going to hand you over to Scott. I'm really looking forward to this session. Scott's going to introduce the Mindful Movement Programme. This was inspired by martial arts. It's currently been delivered in schools, and I'm going to hand you over to Scott Butler now from the Holy Trinity School in Kidderminster, who will be leading the session. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Lovely to see you today, and thank you very much to Anthea and Jonathan and Michelle for inviting me along today. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes just going through a presentation to contextualise what we'll be doing for the next 25 minutes or so. Let me just share my screen 1 second. Now, everything that I demonstrate today, there is a video. So if I go a little bit fast, or if you want to go back over it, there's a video that I'll put a link up later in the chat. It's on the slide, just to make sure that that's disseminated as well. Okay, can you see that presentation slide? Okay, just Yep, excellent. Right. Well, this is my co-presenter, Harriet Moore, who unfortunately is involved in an IT audit or something like that today. So she sends her apologies, and this is me. I should be in school, but I've just had my hip replaced. So this demonstrates that martial arts can be done from a sitting position as well as a standing position and things like that. A little bit about us. We've both been engaged with martial arts, combined for over 45 years or so. Now, earlier on this year, when we saw Brianna Gay's case going through court, her mother was advocating mindfulness in schools. And certainly the Labour government have been talking about getting counsellors within each school. And that's going to take time. So what can we actually put into schools that can be used almost immediately that may have an effect on children and young people's well-being? So the martial arts, before that, the wonderful COVID bug, and our research was contextualised during COVID. The range of studies saying what the impacts of COVID was on children's mental health and well-being, as you can see here. The martial arts have got a history of going back over 60 years of academic research. Just let you have a look through some of those points there that training of the martial arts has been shown. Now, the problem with this is there's been a variety of martial arts, mainly with graduate and postgraduate populations, and very little actually conducted with children. So how do the martial arts benefit? From a psychological point of view, there's some explanations there on the left, and then you've got these benefits that are shown on the right here. The one that we were specifically interested in was increasing self-esteem. If you can increase self-esteem, then it should decrease aggression. It should give more personal control over aspects. Now, the self is a very confused area. We can look at it from a variety of academic disciplines, and my self is different to your self, yet it all takes place in a socio-cultural context. Within that, we need to appreciate that there's a shadow to the self. There are so many different explanations of what the self actually is. You've got Parfit, who says there's no such thing as a self, Ken Wilber's integral theory, Saggioli's psychosynthesis, Csikszentmihalyi's transcendent self, Bruner's transactional self. You've got a pile of selves that people are still, or psychologists are still trying to look at to as to what it explains. The two clearest explanations for the self that I quite like are these ones here, that there's a chameleon self, that it evolves, that it changes, and also that the self is like a unicorn, that the more we try and chase after it, it disappears. We still can't pin down in psychology what this actual self structure is. So, moving into why we studied martial arts. Well, as I say, there was an adult demographic where most research has been engaged with. Harriet and I work with an all-through school in Kidderminster, just southwest of Birmingham. So we were really looking at the primary context, mainly within Year 6. Similarly, martial art research, there's a lot of styles, lots of people with different expertise, lots of focus, and some of the research was just focused on black belts, etc. So we were looking for a standardized approach. In other words, looking at one unified style. Now, as I say, the research demonstrates a variety of benefits, as seen earlier. We just needed to take one aspect that we could research from a quasi-experimental approach. This isn't the first time I've tried to get martial arts in school. My PhD originally was starting on that, but 20 years ago, a whole range of ethical issues of teaching children martial arts, when there were newspaper reports of wannabe Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers beating each other up in the playground. So, it was one of those things where we had to fundamentally ensure that it was safe to train and that it was inclusive for everybody. The limited application means that we didn't want to start teaching martial art techniques, but 5 minutes later are being used in the playground. So this is why we came up with the term the Mindful Movement Program. It was a working title that stayed. We're still looking for a better title, but for the last 3 or 4 years, it seems to have stuck. We also needed to ensure that children could see their progress, that they could get that immediacy of feedback. But ultimately, we needed that integrity within the martial arts, so that people could look at it and say, "Oh yeah, that is martial arts inspired." The style we looked at was this one here called Wing Chun Kuen and also Bagua, and we'll go through these exercises in a moment. But there's the different Chinese terms, some of the techniques where they come from. We gave them more English-sounding names, and names that didn't say poking somebody's eye out or kicking somebody in the tenders or anything like that. So, yeah, it was very much trying to make sure that the students didn't realise it's martial and that it was really just a series of movements. Mixed maths. I can read about this at some other point. If you go onto my website, you can read all about this. To say it's quasi-experimental. We use 2 Year 6 groups, one as control, one as experimental. Harriet and I worked with both groups for that year, so we try to mitigate against any, researcher bias, etc. Our results went on to indicate the measures we used: Rosenberg scale, Hetherington, Peavy's we looked at the state and trait approach to self-esteem. Sorry, I'm going through this quite quickly because I want to move on to the movements. But from that, the experimental group that engaged with the programme increased on both state and trait self-esteem scales. From a qualitative perspective, independently coding these, coming back and actually seeing what the students are saying, mostly they were saying, well, it was relaxing, it was calming, it was fun. People were saying, well, it does strain the arms a little bit. They were starting to wake, but you know, we're looking at that in a positive way, that they could take this and, you know, sense themselves getting stronger. So mandatory Wordle I put there that summarises those qualitative themes. Just linking it back into psychology, Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, we can see from that Wordle that it relates to that sense of flow that you know, is really profound within positive psychology. From a transpersonal psychology point of view, Abraham Maslow's work on the hierarchy of needs extended into looking at self-transcendence characterized by the plateau experience. Although he advocated this about 50 years ago, it's still very underdeveloped. But again, if you look at the word or when you look at the conditions, characteristic and outcomes, then there is a link from training of martial arts to both these two psychological constructs. Okay, so I'm hoping that you're starting to feel fit. We don't need a ball of paper to begin with. But if you've got one to hand, I forgot to bring my piece of paper. I'm going to have to use my notes and screw that up into a ball in a moment. I will just show you the video just for reference. I'll just stick this one up. The series of movements here demonstrated by my son Cameron. This is the second time he's ever gone through it, and we'll be looking at some of these things today. So I'm going a little bit too fast, don't worry. The main thing is to have a little bit of fun. Okay, how are we all feeling then? Are we all ready? Now we're gonna start off. If I can just ask you to rotate your shoulders, just loosen them. If you're anything like me, getting more and more crunched up, sitting in chairs. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to ask you to put your one hand over the other. It doesn't matter if you put your left over your right or your right over your left. And this is called the eagle spreads its wings. Okay, I won't give you a Chinese term, but it's there on video. So it's just going up and down, focusing on your breathing as you breathe in, as you come up, as you go down, breathing out. Now, all these exercises were repeated 8 times, slowly and gradually. And the aspect that we used in school, specifically, we gave everyone, well, we raided the PE cupboard and we gave everyone a plastic ring. So while you're going through that, all of these exercises were using readily available PE equipment. So it gave some feedback, and it meant that the students had something to work with. And you'll see why this is important later on. But you can do it with or without the ring. I think 20 of these are about £1 each on Amazon. So that was eagle spreading its wings. The next one, if I can ask you to start with your hands just facing outwards here. If I do it without the ring, and then I'll put the ring on, and all we're going to do is pretend that we're making a vase. If you've seen that scene from Ghost, Patrick Swayze, that's literally all we're doing here. Going from what's known as Tanzao position into a low Bongzao position in the Wing Chun style. So it's just going in and out. And again, as you come up, breathing in, and as you go down, breathing out. So all these movements are performed quite slowly and with the ring. So as I breathe in, the arms are coming up. And as I breathe out, the arms coming down. Now, needless to say, out of the 8 sessions that we did, if we carry on with that, I'll still continue to talk while you're engaged with this. we did 2 sessions a week over 4 weeks, did pre and post testing, and also a midpoint where we took students' ideas on this and what they liked about it, etc. The core thing was the first couple of sessions, if you give students a ring and you're not in, well, if you're in a gym or not, we did this in the classroom, they're going to play about with it. They need time to have fun with it and experiment with it and throw it about. But after about the 3rd week, they really started getting engaged with this series of movements. And it was quite profound that both Harriet and I, in seeing that, because we really didn't expect that to come through. The next one, if I can just ask you to start from our upper position again, it's called shaking water off your fingers. Now, this is a time of COVID when everyone used to wash their hands and use hand gel and toilet paper because we couldn't get any anywhere. So it was where you're really just sort of shaking the water off your fingers and coming back. And going forwards and shaking water off your fingers and then coming back. Now, as you go out, the breathing out. And as you come in, the breathing in. We're encouraging students to use that deep diaphragmatic breathing, really collecting the mind and body. Excuse me. Now, this doesn't look like anything apart from shaking water off the fingers, but in the true martial arts style, it's actually a finger strike to the eyes, but we're not going to tell the students that. We're just going to get them to shake water off their fingers and come back. And this is one that they really quite liked. It was just something that everyone could have access to, everyone could do. Generally, we did this from a standing position with the knees bent to take pressure off the knees and the hips. But we're all sat here today and doing these movements absolutely perfectly. Well done. Now, if we've got any fans of Kung Fu Panda, forget the 4th film, really didn't rate it at all. But if you go to Kung Fu Panda 3, there's a technique that the pandas do that looks like this. Okay, it's a big circular movement. We're not going to do the circular movement. We're just going to do this final technique that actually comes from a Wing Chun style, and it's called Po Pai. In other words, it's a double palm strike. So we called it crocodile mouth. So what I'd like you to do, can you start with your fingers touching, please? And then as you push forwards and breathe out, you're opening up crocodile mouth. And then as you come back, bring that back, and then rotate the hands over. So the other one on the top as you push forwards. And the crocodile closes its mouth. Again, I'll just do this with the ring just to show you. So breathing out, turn over and breathe in. And breathing out. And coming back in. Okay, breathe out. And coming back in. So I'm not actually counting how many we're doing today, but as I say, we went for 8 being equal on both sides, lucky number in Chinese, etc. So that was crocodile mouth. The next one was a little bit more involved. It's called chopping down the tree. It's a 2-handed movement. So if you can just start with one hand upwards and one hand downwards, okay? And really what you're doing is you're just rolling one back and one forwards and changing that position. Okay, so one hand comes back, my low hand is coming back and my upper hand coming forwards, low hand coming back. Now, I think we gave this another term like rocking the boat on the sea because it can look like quite graceful. But for really what we're doing, I think we even called it pointing to the heaven and earth at some point. But I think it's just called chopping down the tree that we settled on. Now, you can move your body with this. Thankfully, I'm on a seat that actually rotates. And it's very graceful. With the ring, the hands are put in on a different side. And really, this is like a defensive movement in martial arts to give you some body coverage. We took a different version of this where we had one hand up, one hand down, and really it was just going back the other way. So one's chopping a tree down. Just trying to get in the shots. And the other way, hands stay still, and you just move in the other direction. So it was two very similar ones. And we could really see the students, you know, the focus and the engagement was just absolutely profound in trying to correct or get these movements performed correctly. And you know, although, as I say, we only did this with two classes, we've extended this now across the school. It's only really come into the fourth year. We haven't got any data collected on that at the moment. It was just one of those things that we put in place just to see whether we can roll it further, try and get some teacher buy-in and see where that goes. Now, over the last 8 or 9 minutes that I've got, can I just ask you to get your sheet of paper, please? And you just screw it into a ball. Now, normally I'd ask you to bring a cup and saucer around today, but this technique takes a bit of practice, and unless you super glue the cup on the saucer, things can start breaking. So, holding a ball of paper, and I just want you to hold it loosely in your hands. Now, if you've got access to the school PE cupboard, we used one of these marker cones. Again, you can get about 50 of these for about £15 on Amazon. But the movement itself, I'm just going to show you the full movement. It comes from a different martial art called Bagua or Pakwa, and it's an exercise that really teaches a bit of coordination. Now, don't worry, we are going to go through this very simply and slowly in a moment. We'll build up to doing that. It's called a tea serving exercise. So what I want you to imagine is that's a cup of tea. Now, the founder of this style of Kung Fu was serving the emperor tea, or so legend goes, was trying to get through a crowd of people, just like at a beer conference, carrying it around and, you know, just moving up. So it feels a bit like a waiter and, you know, dodging in between. These are great because you can put your thumb through the center. So let's go to the ball of paper. And all I want you to do to begin with, rest it on your hand. I'm pinching mine with a thumb so it doesn't fall off. But all I want you to do is to swing your palm over to your opposite shoulder and backwards. So just get that movement in place first off. So I'm starting with it down at my right-hand side or left-hand side, depending on how Teams mixes up videos, putting my hand forwards and just moving it backwards. Hand forwards and backwards. So it's just coming over to the opposite shoulder. Now, the extension of this movement is the fingers come across, and now what we're going to do is turn the point of the finger behind our head. So it's coming up in a C shape. We're coming to that first position, and then we're just pointing our fingers, so I'm just pointing directly to that wall behind me and arching back down. So it's coming up in like a big C shape if you've got it in your right hand, or a backwards C shape if you've got it on your left hand. Now, most students got this, probably about half the class got it in the first week. The second week, everyone had it, and that sense of triumph when they had this was profound. So we've got it here. Now, the next bit is the awkward bit. So we've gone forwards to step 1. We've gone to step 2. This is where it comes all the way over the head in a big circle, and we can then bring it back around. So it's almost like forming an S. So the fingers are going back, it's coming around. So I'm now pointing over to the other wall and coming back down. My goodness, it's so great to see you all gracefully doing this. This is brilliant. Well done, folks. Unfortunately, I haven't got the hair of Joe Wicks or anything like that, but okay, how are your arms feeling? Are they getting stronger? Don't say they're getting sore. They're getting stronger. So from here, let's go for this whole movement now. So first position, second position, third position. Now this is the bit that takes a little bit awkward. You're just bringing it back to that first position again. So it's a bit like breaststroke. So We're going to go forwards, backwards, over the top. If you can get that over the top, then it really is just bringing the arm back down to the comfortably to the side. Now, you know, I train this stuff daily, but if my muscles are aching, you're doing really well, okay? I'm just going to replace it with the one that we used for the students. And again, we did 8 on each side, or as many as students felt comfortable with. Now, you can try doing that with both hands at the same time, once you've got it in the other side, but that's just going to show off, okay? The last couple of minutes, though, what I want you to try and do now, though, is to bring it backwards and try and do this in repeat. So I'm going to point over to that wall, point behind me, then bring it down to my shoulder. My goodness, folks. So this is looking great. So I'm bringing it under my elbow first off. So I'm really twisting it so my finger's pointing that way. I'm now twisting it over to this way, then behind me, and then back around. If you've only got it one way, don't worry. If you can only go that first way, or if you're still just happy moving this forwards and backwards, it is, you know, that connection of mind, body, even spirit, you could say, from a martial arts is quite profound. You know, martial arts, you could learn most martial arts in probably about 6 months, but spend a lifetime to master. A shout out to the person who I've learned Wing Chun from, or my grandmaster in Hong Kong. He's 100 today, and he's still training. So it's a bit like Tai Chi. It's one of the lesser known martial arts. Although if anyone's seen the Ip Man films, then yeah, it's basically that stuff. And of course, you can go backwards with both hands, but again, that's just really just, you know, it's something to work towards. So in relation to the martial arts and mindful movement, we found that just this series of movements that took maybe about 40 minutes, working on the breathing, working on trying to coordinate the breathing with the techniques, the variety of different techniques we were looking at. We gave a pre, we gave a post measures for both classes. The other class actually decreased in their self-esteem, SATs were looming. But for the experimental class, as I say, it was one PSHE lesson. The other class were working on mindfulness, colouring in, different activities like that. Hear me? Sorry, my connection went. We're only a solo school, so we're not part of a big academy chain. So you know, we're quite limited with getting this out. But you know, thanks to Vera and thanks to Anthea and Jonathan and Michelle asking me to come today. Hopefully, if you're interested in this, you know, do drop me a line. I'm just going to put in the chat box the link to the research and the video. So if you have a look at that, then if you get a quiet 5 minutes, or if the meeting's an example to getting a little bit too stressful today or over the coming weeks, then, you know, just focus on your breathing is the main thing, and then go and get a cup of tea, then show off your tea serving exercises. Okay, I think that pretty much takes me up to time there. So thank you very much for engaging with this. It really has been a delight to share a little bit of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. I think Jonathan may well have dropped out of. Are you back, Jonathan?
I'm back. Thank you, Anthea. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Scott. That was amazing. I really enjoyed that.
That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, then. So, colleagues, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ben Gibson, who's a lecturer in psychology at De Montfort University. Ben specialises in mental health and wellbeing. Ben's research focuses on psychological interventions to support people's mental health and wellbeing. And I'm very excited about this presentation because it's focusing on an evaluation of an outdoor learning intervention for pupils at risk of school exclusion. Thank you, Ben.
Excellent, thank you, Jonathan. I hope my presentation can live up to your excitement and to everybody else's. So let me start by sharing my screen. Just bear with me a second. Okay, hopefully. Let me try this again.
Let's go.
Right, so yeah, my name is Ben Gibson. Jonathan mentioned that I'm a lecturer in psychology at Montfort University in Leicester. And today I want to talk a little bit about a study that I was involved in actually when I was at Liverpool John Moores University. We were invited by Community by Nature, which is a charity in Merseyside, to evaluate a programme that they run. So Community by Nature, or CBN for short, run, amongst other things, an outdoor learning intervention for young people aged 11 to 16, so primarily secondary school children at risk of school exclusion. So as part of the programme, what we offer is basically an opportunity to connect with the natural world. So the idea is that children are referred to the programme either by the council or by the school to basically come along in small groups to go out into the woods with an experienced practitioner to learn survival skills, to take part in sort of a camp setting, to learn to use tools, to make tools, to build shelters, to get involved in what we call arboriculture, which is effectively kind of management of trees, shrubs, and other sort of hardy perennial kind of plants, with a real kind of focus on sort of supporting social skills, kind of that emotional intelligence, and obviously more pro-social behaviours as well. It's one of those of the team behind the programme, very proud of it, and they've had a lot of they have a lot of anecdotal evidence that the programme works. They've had a lot of really positive feedback from the likes of the schools and the council that they're partnered with, but also from parents and from the children involved, the pupils involved in the programme as well. But what we wanted us to do was to basically come along and sort of really kind of get basically some scientific evidence, also some early kind of evidence of the effectiveness of their programme. So we came along and we conducted the study. So this mixed methods examination of the feasibility, crucially, and we'll come back to this whole feasibility idea a little bit later, but also the mechanisms and the effectiveness of this outdoor learning intervention for young people at risk of exclusion. So, give me a second. Right, there we go. So, talked a little bit about this idea of an outdoor learning intervention, but you might be sitting there thinking, well, what is that? So, Price defines an outdoor learning intervention as an approach to learning that occurs predominantly outside of a classroom, potentially quite obviously, but it also encompasses a strong emphasis on working with others, which I think is very important, a real key part of any good outdoor learning intervention, key to some of its effectiveness, I think. But it also includes these practical activities as well, which is also very important, that provides children, people with the opportunity to learn about themselves, about others, but also about the natural environment as well. So obviously, we were approached to do this, but we are scientists. We are, we had some agency in this. It was a collaboration, and we were interested in getting involved in this because we felt that what Community by Nature were doing, continues to do, is quite novel. But on paper, it seems like a really good idea as well. We know from research that outdoor learning interventions, whatever kind of shape they sort of take, can support the health, so the physical and the mental health, as well as the development and the academic achievements of young people from a variety of backgrounds. So it's not one of those interventions that just supports, say, for example, boys or children of slightly wealthier sort of parents. It is sort of quite kind of an equal sort of opportunities kind of sort of approach. And so outdoor learning interventions may take the form of like a forest schools, which you might be a bit more familiar with. But just to stress that the intervention that Community by Nature run isn't a forest school per se. A forest school typically tends to be aimed more towards primary school children, and again the focus there I think is a little bit more on kind of play, whereas obviously what Community by Nature sort of doing geared more towards slightly older children, and again is about supporting the needs of a very unique group. So a lot of the research I think is more on kind of the forest school side of things. It is more on kind of younger children, and certainly there didn't seem to be any research going into sort of looking at sort of the needs of particularly vulnerable adolescents, especially those at risk of exclusion. So we really wanted to understand how and whether this specially tailored outdoor intervention could support young people's social and emotional well-being, but also potentially reduce the risk of future involvement in antisocial behaviour and criminal activity as well. And again, what we know about outdoor learning interventions is that, again, just being outside does tend to reduce stress. We know that being outdoors as well, if nothing else, is an opportunity to get away from the classroom, get away from that stressful environment. And there was some kind of preliminary research as well suggesting that even amongst adolescents more generally, being outdoors generally is good for kind of the well-being and for kind of reducing kind of the risk of those kind of more antisocial behaviours. So this was the team I was a part of. So like I said, I was at Liverpool John Moores University at the time, and I was supported by Dr. Emma Ashworth and Dr. Lisa Newson. And then we also had a team over at Community by Nature as well. So we were supported by Kate Jameson, who's the CEO, as well as Dr. Joe Sayers, who is involved with Community by Nature, but is also based at the University of Cumbria as an academic there as well. So, like I mentioned, this was a mixed methods kind of feasibility study. So you'll notice straight away that we have quite a sort of a small sample size. This isn't certainly an evaluation on a scale of the likes of what Alex was talking about earlier. So we had a quant component, we had a qual component. So we took surveys pre and post intervention with the kind of the full kind of cohort, which, as mentioned earlier, is quite small. So we had a sample of 8 students. A variety of age ranges, but we were all from the same school, and we took measures of well-being, resilience, perceived stress, behaviour, especially around kind of obviously antisocial behaviours, but also pro-social behaviours as well, self-regulation, as well as attitudes towards delinquency. We basically sort of measured pre and post scores, or we compared pre and post scores using t-tests, so quite sort of simple analysis, not too fancy. And then with the qual component, we did some one-to-one interviews with some of those students who took part in the pre and post intervention. In the pre and post intervention quantitative aspects of the study. But we also brought back and spoke to a couple of returning students, so students who'd been involved in the intervention before, but were now a little bit older, sort of moved on, sort of beyond sort of secondary school. We also talked to a couple of staff as well that were involved in the program. So we had somebody who was involved in the development of the program, somebody who was involved in the delivery of the program, and we had a member of sort of teaching staff as well at one of the schools that was partnered with CBN for the delivery of this program. And in terms of the analysis of this, we used reflective thematic analysis. So in terms of our quantitative results, so again, obviously bear in mind we had quite a small sample size, but it is feasibility, and I think we still had some fairly interesting results. So we saw significant changes in perceived stress and in goals and aspirations. So we saw that young people seem to become less stressed following engagement with the intervention. And we also saw that young people seemed to become better able to imagine a more positive future for themselves as well. So really encouraging results there. Unfortunately, we didn't find any evidence of significant changes in terms of well-being, behaviour, attitudes and resilience. And I should mention as well that the intervention ran over a 5-month period. So kind of there was, certainly that kind of time for us to see changes. Unfortunately, we didn't during this sort of time period. Then go to our qualitative results. We developed 3 themes, which we then broke down into sort of smaller sub-themes. So main themes were this idea of kind of a preferable learning environment, a transformative experience, and the future of outdoor interventions. So again, we took the full 9 participants, so that kind of mixture of perspectives to kind of inform these themes. And I think what we found again was kind of broadly quite positive. So both students and staff felt like this was an opportunity for novel experiences. It's a great way of building confidence, but importantly, especially importantly for this cohort as well, we saw a real development of trust and a sense of mutual respect between sort of the young people and the staff out there delivering the intervention. Obviously really important for this cohort. I think one of the things that kind of came out, certainly in terms of qualitative, was this idea that, students didn't necessarily have a lot of respect for the teachers, have a lot of respect for authority more generally with adults, which might explain some of the kind of the risk for the risk for exclusion. But there was something about being out there in the woods, getting involved in these activities that I think allowed that to build. Part of it, I suspect, was the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, they were given the opportunity to build tools and to use tools. One of those tools was like a knife. So you can imagine that you're a kid at risk of exclusion, you're getting shouted at all the time, and all of a sudden you go out onto the woods and you're given a knife. Obviously, with kind of the understanding that you use it in a way that is safe. You're not using it to sort of messing around with it. And I think that kind of inherent trust and that sort of building kind of rapport, I think, was really, really important. And I think that then led to this idea that kind of the forest school became, sorry, not the forest school, the outdoor intervention became this kind of transformative experience. And we saw, this emotional development, we saw the social development, and, especially when we sort of spoke to kind of the older kids, we saw this sort of changing of their lives as well. Kids talked about, just, the fact that they were at risk. A lot of kind of kids in this area are at a particular risk of kind of gang violence, being groomed for gangs. And some of them talked about the fact that if it wasn't for the school, that they'd be in prison. One of them talked about the fact that actually now they work as a tree surgeon. So they've taken what they've learned as part of this and applied it and made a career out of it. And then we also see all the kind of people involved talking about kind of the future, what we want. So the students talking about what they want to do in the future. A lot of them talking about this idea of sort of staying involved in the program in some regard. And then obviously kind of the members of staff, ETC as well, talking about what they want to see for the future as well. There was a real recommendation of the program, again, for both obviously from staff, but also from sort of the pupils involved, which I think, again, really, really encouraging. Quickly, I've got a couple of select quotes here. I'm just obviously a bit sort of conscious of time. The top 3 are from some of the pupils some of the students who sort of returned to come talk to us about their experience. And again, if we look at that third quote in particular, you can see that actually, it's I mentioned earlier that kind of the idea of the program is about sort of bringing people together. There is a real kind of sort of a teamwork kind of aspect to it. There was kind of this idea that the camp in particular, so students, so pupils would learn to kind of cook, and we'd sort of come together at the end of each day, reflect, sort of air out any grievances, which I think at the beginning could be a little bit tense, but I think again over time sort of worked almost, I think as one member of staff sort of described it, almost like therapeutic, and the pupils really able to bond over that a little bit. And I think what we see is evidence that actually that's led to lasting kind of friendships. So see here, so me and the boys still in touch now, still go on days out, and we're still talking about trees, which I think is really sort of nice. And again, think about this kind of like this encouragement of pro-social behaviours as well. If we have a look at this last quote from the member of staff delivering the programme, so he's out there with some of the kids out there, and he talks about this one boy in particular who's quite challenging in the classroom, a little bit of a bully, but actually when he's out in the woods, he started developing these really good relationships, especially with some of the younger children, and actually ended up sort of working as a bit of a mentor. So he's supporting those other kids, but we're also seeing that kind of development in him as well. So if we kind of bring the results together, what we find sort of consistently is this idea of this reduction in stress. It's not particularly surprising. Again, because of the fact that we know from research on green spaces in particular that just being outside, regardless of who you are, being in the forest, assuming it's not late at night or you've not got lost, is calming, it's relaxing, it's nice to be out in nature. We know the physiological benefits as well as the kind of mental health benefits to being out in nature. And we saw that reflecting the quantitative findings, but also in some of the themes that we developed. Again, part of that as well, I know one of the pupils mentioned to me that they like just being outside of a classroom, where we felt like being in a classroom meant they were just getting yelled at all the time, being shouted at, things quite high pace, very academic. But you go outside, all of a sudden, things are calmer. You're doing stuff with your hands, so you're taking more like what we suppose we'd call like a kinesthetic learning approach. And you can see immediately kind of like the sort of the fruits of your labor, if you will. If you build a tool, you build a shelter, you can see that. Whereas if you're doing maths, you're doing English, can you see your kind of improvement? Maybe not quite the same way. So that could probably contribute to that a little bit as well. The development of goals and aspirations was kind of a unique thing that we looked at as part of the study. We also feel it's quite a unique finding. And again, those kind of novel experiences in particular. So again, showing sort of pupils that they can do things that maybe they didn't realise that they could do. Again, if they're getting shouted at all the time, your self-esteem is probably not great. Your confidence probably isn't good, which is then going to have a knock-on impact for your, for the way that you conceptualise yourself and the way that you think about your goals and your future. So all of a sudden, you're going outside, you realise that you can do things, you're supported. I think huge. Again, developing those new relationships as well, I think is very important. Again, we know that having a strong social network, having that support, again, having people around you who understand you and understand your experiences, that you can kind of bond with, I think very important. And again, the staff involved in delivery talks about this idea of kind of sort of perseverance, give that kind of space away from the classroom to learn and fail on their own terms is also sort of quite important. We know, again, if you're in a classroom and you just have to sort of move on all the time, you're not given that opportunity to sort of fail, and failure is seen as a bad thing. It's not going to be great for your self-esteem. It's not going to be great for, again, your conceptualization yourself. But going out there, it's very clear when you've not been able to do something right. If the shelter falls down, for example, you're not done it right. But again, you're supported. you go back at it and you give them that opportunity to try again. Obviously, I suppose we were interested in whether these changes would be long term. Some of the qualitative findings, I think you could make that argument would suggest that. Again, just briefly, there was some suggestions in the themes suggesting that the intervention may lead to more slow, positive changes to pro-social behaviours, self-regulation over time, especially as evidenced by some of those conversations that I had with kind of the older kind of students who, again, gone from being in a position where, they're at physical risk of harm, of involvement in sort of criminal kind of behaviours, completely changing their lives around, and sort of, having sort of kids and, kids of their own, having careers and, positive relationships. Huge. Think a little bit about the future.
Thank you. Ben, is it okay to wrap it up now?
Yeah,
soon?
absolutely. We're just
sorry, thank you. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, Jonathan, I got thrown off a little bit because
I know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. This is the last bit.
Yeah.
So again, we just talked a little bit about this idea of sort of what we can do in the future. A couple of students, as well as a couple of members of staff, talked about this idea of kind of like just staying in the program for longer. So we have this idea of maybe a mentorship program where those who've been involved before can come back, support the deliverer in, again, building those relationships. You could say, do want to stress, obviously, you're working with sort of students who are at risk, so they display a lot of challenging behaviours. So it is important that we get the right staff, and that obviously these things are run properly. Again, appreciate it, around out of time. So if anybody does have any questions, I can elaborate on stuff around sample size, etc. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ben. That was amazing. And I've got I'm now thinking about Finland, and I'm sure that Amy's thinking about Finland, and because we know the approaches they use over there, very much focused on outdoor learning in Finland up until about the age of 7 or 8. And this is making me think about why we need to have this approach for all children across the whole curriculum, not just for a specified group of children. I think this is really, really important research. Okay, shall we, Anthea, how do you want to do the next bit? Is it you or Amy's going to do the next section?
Amy, if she's here.
Amy.
Is she not here? If not, do we have any questions for any of our presenters that have spoken this morning for the panel? And we've got our student as well on the panel. So we've got a few minutes for questions. So Nicola, would you like to go first? Got your hand up.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, thank you. Oh, that was absolutely fascinating. And I agree. I think we could listen to it all day and longer. I'm particularly interested in, Ben, in your presentation, as I'm just writing up the findings from my PhD on outdoor learning. But particularly I've been doing my research with pupils with cognition and learning difficulties, so specifically those more with diagnosed moderate, severe and profound and multiple learning difficulties, and particularly those well, it's essentially taken place in special schools, just to sort of give you a flavour of sort of the cohort. And I was just sort of wondering, firstly, have you published a paper yet on your findings, but also kind of, and I agreed with Jonathan's comment a moment ago that sort of what's coming out of my findings is, and I've interviewed educators and pupils, sort of a bit like yourself as well, Ben, it's just how profound the difference is taking the children outside. And we often sort of see these comments, Facebook or whatever, that you put somebody in the wrong environment and they are squashed, and you put them in a different environment, and it just, obviously it speaks very loudly to me, because my whole research is getting kids out into nature, and I think also sort of the remit of the research that you did, that it's not a forest school, and I think that's really important, because I think one of the problems at the moment that I found in my research was that a lot of educators thought, well, I can't do outdoor learning because I'm not a forest school trained practitioner. And it's kind of like, no, it's like everybody can go out and use nature. So I've got so many questions for you, but I suppose it's really, combining your research, Ben, and also Jonathan's comment as to where is the future to try and get this more, across the board. Obviously there's huge constraints from head teachers, from teachers as in delivering the statutory curriculum, whatever, but actually if the benefits are that, children might not be engaging if they are bored in the classroom or they're in the wrong environment, etc. But so I suppose, I don't know what my question is, to be honest. I'm just it's like, where do we as professionals get this out more, I suppose?
I'm thinking person environment fit theory might be a useful theoretical way of framing this.
What was that, sorry, Jonathan?
Person environment fit theory, or
yeah,
I think sometimes it's called is it called stage environment fit theory? Or anyway, person environment fits. It's about, is the person fitting the environment, or is the environment adapted to suit the person, and how does that then engender a sense of belonging, etc. I think Ben, you're probably going to get loads of emails after this.
That works for me.
Okay. Do you want to just put your email in the chat, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of those things we were talking about sharing the slides, and I do have it there, but let me just
Okay, great.
Have you got any more short questions?
Questions?
Jonathan's breaking up again, and Amy's having trouble with her internet. So have you got any more short questions? Because I'm conscious that time is running out.
I had a little question for Crystal.
Go ahead, Jonathan, if your internet will allow. I think we might have lost Jonathan again. Does anybody else have any questions while we're waiting for Jonathan to come back online? There seem to be quite a lot of problems with the...
I've got a question, Anthea.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just, while my internet's working, I'll get it out quick. I just wondered how hopeful people are feeling with the new government about some of these things changing. Maybe keep it to a sentence answer if you can.
Good. Would any of you, Crystal, would you like to comment on that, or Alex?
I think we all share the same views that we would all love to see a lot more implemented in the classroom, but teachers are heavily constrained and financially and just heavily workloaded, and we see this in the university sector as well. So we hope that there'll be more funding and more support. I think that's the hope. But in the meantime, we can all come together and support each other and encourage each other with the research that we have at the moment.
I can step in. I think, you're right. It's the time and money side. And, if we are looking at getting trained counsellors, etc., into every school, it's going to take time. But it's taking those things that we can do. We can easily take students out into the playground tomorrow or even this afternoon, following on from Ben's work. So I think it is looking at what the research is saying about children's mental health and well-being, and finding things that we can, the evidence informed, and coming up with succinct research summaries with practical guidance that can be shared amongst schools and teachers pretty quickly would be one way forwards.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I've been fortunate to be involved in a lot of funded work that's allowed us to look at how we can support wellbeing and mental health in schools. But it's now what can that look like in practice, and can we take that and put it into schools now and have the funding and support for that in practice.
Yeah, I think it's just it's that change in priority as well. I think as well, right? And I think hopefully the new government, we do see that prioritization, that kind of just that understanding that schools do need support and children need support. And I mean, I know I've been trying to do some more research with kids this year, and you know, it's even been difficult doing the research because we've just not had the time, we've just not had the space, even though like they agree that the research that I'm doing would benefit in the long term, we just don't have that space for the short term, you know. So hopefully that's one of those things that we see change.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Jonathan, did you want to sum up now if there's no more questions?
I just actually had a question for Crystal, but you may have addressed it because I was just thrown out for a second there. So the question was, obviously you've explored the relationship between food and diet and nutrition, the importance of nutrition in terms of mental health and also physical health. But what about the situation of millions of children living in poverty? And we know that there's a strong link between poverty and poor mental health, but also poverty and food availability. And some of the more expensive foods, like the fruit and the veg and the non-processed foods, are really expensive, and therefore, there's a big issue there with people in poverty. I think it really affects their food choices and food availability.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. That it's quite complex, and I think the social economic environment definitely does impact. But I feel it's quite having children having access to schools, and we realize that there are concerns for provision for proper healthy meals in the school meals, and the sort of financial provision for that. But where we can make a difference is that if we engage and learn with the resources that we have, we can change habits. So things like getting them interactive and learning about foods, the food systems, getting them interacting with food in more of an experiential learning approach will help them to engage and change preferences. And we don't need a lot of money for that. And I understand there's a huge chasm of resources that some children just don't get breakfast and lunch, or breakfast and proper dinner. So I realize that there's a whole chasm of that. But with what we can do in the school environment is increase that exposure with the resources that we have. So the Taste Ed method, talks about that kind of really experiential, and sometimes just showing pictures of fruit and vegetables can help to increase acceptability and preference. And in some cases, there is a lot going on with the social and economic environment. In other words, sometimes fruits and vegetables are much more expensive because they perish easily. We don't have places to store them. Often homes don't have places to actually make them. In other words, we often say, well, it's easy to cook a meal, a healthy meal, but in actual fact, it uses electricity, it uses cutting resources. People don't have those skills. So there are charities that we can engage with that do offer support and engage with and help to equip people with those resources and understand what those barriers are. And so I haven't really focused on that for that talk, but there are resources out there to support us. But I think for what we can do within schools is increase that education and that exposure, and that change in preference is very powerful.
Yeah, thank you very much. We could continue this conversation all day. It's fascinating. We'll wrap it up now because obviously it's time. Really, really interesting presentations from all the speakers. Thank you, everyone. Again, if you're willing to share your emails, then that'd be a really good way to just follow up. I'm sure that lots of people will want to email you and continue the conversation further, but I've certainly really enjoyed the morning. I've really enjoyed all the presentations, and I feel that I've learned a lot actually through the presentations. Yeah, and I enjoyed the interactive elements as well to the session, so thank you for that, Scott. That was great. Anthony, do you want to say anything? Amy?
No, just thank you all very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions. And I think the next time we put on an event, it will probably be in person. So that's something to maybe bear in mind. Obviously,
hopefully we'll see colleagues at Beira as well in September.
Yeah. Come and see us at Beira, and also on our our Twitter. I keep calling it Twitter. It's X now, isn't it? But our social media. You can get in touch with us there as well. We'd love to hear from you.
And our contact details are on the BERA website as well, if anybody wanted to get hold of any of us.
Keep doing the good work, everybody. It's really important work. It makes a difference. Thank you very much.
And have a lovely afternoon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you.